From a Solheim Cup villain moment that made players cry, to stars who divided golf over unearned hype, attitude, and controversy, these are the 8 most hated female players in golf history. And first, we start with number 8. Number 8, Hailey Davidson. This entry is different from the rest of the list, because Hailey Davidson did not become controversial because of trash talk, cheating, or some infamous on-course meltdown. She became controversial because her very presence in women's golf turned into one of the sport's biggest modern debates. In 2024, Davidson's attempt to advance through LPGA qualifying triggered a massive backlash. Reports surfaced that 275 current and former female golfers had signed a letter asking golf's governing bodies to change the rules that allowed players assigned male at birth to compete in women's events. Then, by the end of that year, the LPGA and USGA updated their policies in a way that would make Davidson ineligible going forward. And that is what makes this case so explosive. Because the argument around Davidson stopped being about one golfer, it turned into a fight over fairness, biology, eligibility, and what women's golf should allow. At one point, Davidson also said she had received death threats, which tells you just how ugly the reaction became. So no, this is not the classic sports villain story. But in terms of pure backlash, few women in recent golf history have drawn this much anger this quickly. 7. Michelle Wie. Michelle Wie was not hated because she broke rules. She was hated by some because people got tired of the hype. For years, Michelle Wie was treated like a future savior of women's golf. She was a prodigy, a phenom, a teenager playing against men, landing massive media attention, and carrying expectations that most pros never face in an entire career. And at first, that level of attention created just as much resentment as admiration. That is what made her so polarizing. It was not just random fans rolling their eyes either. Golf Digest noted that her critics included Annika Sorenstam, Judy Rankin, and Dottie Pepper. When names like that are publicly questioning you, the backlash is real. And you can understand why it happened. To a lot of people, Michelle Wie started to feel bigger than her resume. The endorsements were huge. The spotlight was non-stop. The story was always enormous, even when the results had not fully caught up yet. So for a stretch, she became the player people pointed to when they wanted to complain about overhype in golf. Eventually, of course, Wie validated plenty of the hype. She won big. She built a real career. But that early backlash never fully disappeared. And that is why Michelle Wie belongs here. She was not just a star. For a long time, she was the star people loved to resent. Number 6. Cristie Kerr. Some golfers become polarizing because of one huge scandal. Cristie Kerr became polarizing more because of her reputation. Golf Digest once wrote that Kerr could be famously moody, and Kerr herself later admitted that when she first joined the LPGA Tour, she was short with people and a bit of a brat. Looking back, she said she would have treated people better, signed more autographs, smiled more, and been more patient. That kind of self-reflection tells you the reputation was not invented out of thin air. She knew it existed too. Then came moments that added fuel to that image. One example was the 2017 playoff at the Lotte Championship, where slow play criticism piled up after a 6-hole playoff dragged on for around 2 hours. Kerr apologized, but even then, it came with a caveat. She said she was sorry, but immediately pointed out that the other player was also playing slowly, which made it feel less like a full apology. So her story is not about some scandal, it is about friction. Cristie Kerr was the kind of player who could wear people down. She had the talent and the resume, but also an intensity that could make her easier to respect than to love. And sometimes, in sports, that is more than enough to land you on a list like this. Number 5. Natalie Gulbis. Natalie Gulbis, became controversial for a reason that golf keeps wrestling with to this day. She made people ask a question the sport still has not fully answered. How much of a golfer's fame should come from golf? And how much can come from image? Because when Gulbis rose to fame, it was not just her play people were talking about, it was the branding, the bikini calendar, the glamorous image, the sense that she was becoming famous for something bigger than scorecards. And some people in golf were really not happy with that. The Guardian put it brutally, saying there was little doubt Gulbis was selling sex rather than well-struck six-irons. That line tells you exactly what the backlash was. To critics, Natalie Gulbis was not just a player. She was evidence that women's golf was drifting toward marketing and appearance instead of pure competition. Now, whether that was fair is another conversation. Because Gulbis did not create that system by herself, she played within it and arguably benefited from it. But once she became the most visible symbol of that approach, she also became the easiest target. That is why she works so well on this list. She represents a very specific kind of golf resentment, the kind aimed at players who become bigger celebrities than their results alone might justify. Number 4. Jan Stevenson. If Natalie Gulbis was the modern version of that controversy, Jan Stevenson was the original one. Long before social media, long before influencer golf, Stevenson had already become one of the most divisive figures the women's game had ever seen. And that is not an exaggeration. Stevenson was talented enough to matter, glamorous enough to stand out, and controversial enough to split opinion for years. What made her so polarizing was not just her image, it was what her image came to represent. She became tied to the LPGA's broader effort to market women's golf through sex appeal, magazine covers, glamour shots, a public image that often overshadowed her actual ability. And the moment that starts happening, the golf world usually breaks into two camps. One side says, this helps the sport grow. The other says, this cheapens the sport. Stevenson ended up right in the middle of that fight. That is why she ranks higher than Gulbis. Because with Jan Stevenson, the controversy feels bigger, more foundational. She was one of the first major women's golf stars to become the center of a real identity crisis for the sport. Number 3. Babe Didrikson Zacharias. Babe Didrikson Zacharias is one of the greatest athletes who ever lived. But easy to like? Not always. What made Babe so fascinating is that the same thing that made her unforgettable also made some people uncomfortable. She was dominant, outspoken, ultra-competitive, and not even a little interested in pretending to be humble. LPGA's own bio recalls her famous line, "Who is going to finish second?" and says that it was that brashness that rubbed some of her peers the wrong way. And honestly, of course it did. Think about the era she was in. Women were not expected to carry themselves with that kind of swagger, but Babe did it anyway. She did not soften her confidence to make other people comfortable. She did not hide how great she thought she was. And because she backed it up with her performance, that confidence only hit harder. That is what makes Babe such an important entry on this list. She was hated by some because she was almost too much, too good, too loud, too sure of herself. She gave women's golf one of its first, truly larger-than-life personalities. And larger-than-life personalities almost always create enemies. Number 2. Paige Spiranac. Paige Spiranac might be the most obvious modern entry on this list. Because Paige was never just a golfer. She became a cultural argument. To her fans, she helped make golf bigger, younger, and more accessible. To her critics, she became the face of everything they thought was going wrong with the sport. One major trigger point came in 2015, when Spiranac received a sponsor exemption into the Omega Dubai Ladies Masters. She was not an LPGA star at the time. In fact, she was not even close to the top of the women's pro game. She was a former college player whose social media fame had exploded. Then she shot 77 and 79 and missed the cut. To critics, That felt like confirmation that attention had jumped ahead of merit. Then came the even bigger moment. In 2016, Golf Digest put Paige on the cover of its Innovators and Influencers issue instead of Lydia Ko, who at the time was the top-ranked player in women's golf. That decision drove people crazy. Julie Inkster publicly questioned it, basically asking why Lydia Ko was not on the cover instead. Because that was the real argument. Was golf now rewarding fame over achievement? Was influence becoming more valuable than excellence? Paige became the symbol of that fear. And when one person becomes the face of a culture war inside a sport, the backlash usually gets intense. That is exactly what happened here. And now, number 1 on our list, Suzann Pettersen. If the rest of this list is about backlash, resentment, and polarization, Suzann Pettersen is different. She had one of the clearest villain moments women's golf has ever seen, and it happened at the 2015 Solheim Cup. On the 17th green, Allison Lee lifted a short putt after the Americans believed it had been conceded. But Pettersen and Team Europe said it had not been given, so Europe was awarded the hole and went on to win the match. The fallout was immediate. Allison Lee and Charlie Hull were left in tears, and Laura Davies said she was disgusted by what happened. Pettersen later apologized, saying she had never felt more gutted and truly sad, and admitting that she had put the single match and the point that could be earned ahead of sportsmanship and the game of golf itself. That is why this moment still defines her place on a list like this. Unlike the others, her controversy was not abstract. It came down to one unforgettable scene. For many fans, Suzann Pettersen was no longer just a fierce competitor. She was the woman who chose the point over the spirit of the game on one of golf's biggest stages. And that is why she sits at number 1. Because very few players have ever been cast as the unmistakable villain of a moment the way Suzann Pettersen was at the Solheim Cup.